All right. Well, hello again, church, and hello to Dr. Andre and Petrina Branch. Thank you for all joining us again. And just if you didn't see the first video in this series, let me introduce a little bit about what we're doing here. And Dr. Andre and Petrina Branch are part of our faith community. They live here in Chula Vista. They're part of our faith community through their daughter, Armani's participation in our kids choirs for a number of years now. Their home church is elsewhere, but they have become a part of our faith community in multiple ways, and both of them active in a number of organizations throughout the San Diego area. And if you want to know more, just introduction of them or what we're trying to accomplish, there is a first video and first conversation, and I would encourage you to watch that first conversation. And our hope is that we would have about a 30-minute conversation here, and we were joking before we hit record that you put a preacher and a professor and an attorney together in one room, and you're guaranteed to get a long conversation. So at some point, we will cut ourselves off about 30 minutes, and we hope that you will find this to be a meaningful conversation, and certainly a needed conversation in the world in which we live. So as promised, last time we said that we're going to talk about, define, try to understand, look at multiple aspects of white privilege. We hear that a lot in the news and in over the last couple weeks. Some of us might understand a little bit about what that is, but I wonder if we might just jump in, Andre and Petrina, and share with us when folks talk about white privilege, what are we really talking about?
So I have lived 61 years as an African American male, and have watched white people, lived among white people all my life. And I've seen white privilege operating. In addition to which, in my capacity as a professor at San Diego State, I teach a course called Introduction to Multicultural Education, which is essentially a diversity course for teachers. And we must delve into issues of race and ethnicity. It seems to me, from what I've read over the years, the life that I've lived, both here and abroad, I've lived and worked in several other countries, different states in this country. It seems to me white privilege is an assumed goodness in all situations and circumstances of life, all of which is afforded by the whiteness of one's skin. That is, white people are assumed to be innocent, to be full of integrity. They are perceived to have all of these attributes that are positive and good, and they are prescribed or assumed because of the whiteness of their skin solely. If there's any question that comes up, the assumption is that there's something positive because of the whiteness of the skin. So that's a definition that I work with. I think
there's a couple of definitions I wanted to put out there. For example, one writer has said, white privilege is the reality that a white person's whiteness has come and continues to come with an array of benefits and advantages not shared by people of color. Another woman named Peggy McIntosh stated in an article called White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, that white privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions, maps, passports, code books, visas, tools, and blank checks. Another writer has stated that privilege exists when one group has something of value that is denied to others simply because of group membership and not based on what a person or group has done or failed to do. Essentially, white privilege should be viewed as basically a built-in advantage. You know, as white people live their lives, there's things that they benefit from. Some is just unconscious and some of it's conscious, but it allows them to live their lives without worrying, is race playing a factor in this situation?
In fact, I would just add that white people learn and are taught to not see white privilege. I think in more instances than not, white people will say they are unaware of this privilege.
But I do want to add that white privilege is not a suggestion that white people have never struggled. It's also not an assumption that white people have not earned things that they've accomplished. It's more that as all of us go through life, whiteness provides an advantage, you know, a leg up, opportunities others don't have. But it's not to assume that white people don't struggle or haven't worked for things that they've earned. They just have this sort of built-in advantage.
Because of the skin.
Right.
So we were talking in the last conversation, and Dr. Branch and I giving two different scenarios about when police officers, law enforcement showed up at our homes, and a very different response that I received than he received, and which would be I suppose an example of that. And Petrina, so as you had shared with me a little bit a list of some things that people of color need to share with their kids that I may never need to share with my kids. And this might be a good place to share that, to get so that our viewers can have something really concrete to wrap their minds around this issue.
So yeah, I just wanted to share something I found on the internet. Apparently a Black teen created a TikTok video in which he shared the list of rules that his mom has provided to him, starting when he was about 11 years old, when he went out into the world. And this, you know, resonated with me because I've heard over and over again how Black parents have to coach their children about how to be in the world to essentially keep them alive, especially when they might be confronted by law enforcement. So here are some of the things, and I'm not going to read every one of them, but here are some things that this Black, I think he's now 18 years old, Black man said that he was told by his mother. Don't put your hands in your pockets. Don't put your hoodie on. Don't be outside without a shirt on. Check in with your people even when you're down the street. Don't be out too late. Don't touch anything you're not buying. Never leave the store without a receipt or a bag, even if it's just a pack of gum. Never make it look like there's an altercation between you and someone else. Never leave the house without your ID. Let's see what other ones. Don't ride with music too loud. Don't stare at a Caucasian woman. If a cop stops you randomly and starts questioning you, don't talk back, just compromise. if you ever get pulled over, put your hands on the dashboard and ask if you can get your license and registration out. So those are just, I think those are most of, those are most of what he said. And again, it just speaks to the fact that Black parents have to worry, you know, every time their child leaves the house about how they're going to be treated, particularly how they're going to be treated by law enforcement. And the cases that we've talked about, you know, from George Floyd to all the other cases we've mentioned in the past, where people have been treated brutally by police officers, it sort of shows you why this type of conversation must be had by Black parents. And I'm not sure if white parents have these kind of conversations, but they certainly have the privilege of not having at least some of these conversations, and have the privilege of not having some of those concerns when their children leave the house.
And they don't have to think about it. And it is important to know that these conversations, these bits of advice are born of real situations. You know, don't play your music too loud. I immediately think of the Black teens who were shot in their car by a man who was next to them at a red light and said their music was too loud. More of the people around the world know of Trayvon Martin having been killed, and his hoodie was involved in both the altercation and his subsequent death. I mean, because of clothes that the young man was wearing.
Yeah, he was viewed as suspicious, quote unquote, because of the hoodie.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
I think this points to, again, the fact that white people don't have to think about this. They have the privilege of not having these conversations or not even thinking about their whiteness. We've made reference to this article by Peggy McIntosh a number of times, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. I want to read and provide an example of one of the items that she mentions in this article. And I apologize for reading to you. It will only be one sentence. But she says in that article, her schooling followed this pattern. Whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative, and average, and also ideal, so that the work that they do to benefit others is seen as work that will allow the them, in quotes, to be more like us. I read that and I thought of the countless times in my classes when I introduce the construct of race. Students tell us what their race is and what it means for them to be whatever race they are. I can't tell you the number of white students who've said, when asked what their race is, they reply, normal. Or they will say, regular. They are white students, and they perceive their race to be the normal race, the regular race, nothing out of the ordinary. And I think this assumption of normality, regularity, has implications for decisions that one makes. it has implications of perceiving their entire lives as neutral or normative. It has implications for white people perceiving that the decisions that they make are also normative and neutral. That is, decisions that they would make, that they make on a regular basis every day, have nothing to do with race. Why? Because they're regular, they're normal, they are neutral.
This idea,
Go ahead.
This idea of normative impacts just so much you see in everyday life. You know, what's on TV? You know, who's the villain? Who's the star? Do you see people of color? Do you not see people of color? And all of that, those images, you know, what's on magazine covers? Historically, you know, magazine covers or magazine ads have featured, you know, white people, white women, and then that starts to define what beauty is, who's important. It also, for example, with what you see on TV, whether it's in the movies or the TV, influences what we see as the stereotypes, the biases. If characters are perceived as bad, then that stereotype gets, you know, built into our society. And biases get built into the
stereotype is perceived as bad by white people.
Right.
White people get to decide what is normative.
What's good, what's bad. That all kind of gets built into our society.
What is acceptable and what isn't. All of that is defined by white folks who are still the ones, the group that is in power in the country in which we live, and they tend to define what appropriate mores are. One of the lists of daily effects of white privilege that McIntosh offers, and she offers many, but one of them, and I'm not suggesting for a moment that it is the most important, because it isn't, but it is one that I think a lot of people can immediately identify with, and so I want to mention it. She says that as a white person, one of the daily effects is that she can go into a music store and be confident that she can find music that represents her race. She says she can go into a supermarket and find staple foods that fit with a white person's cultural traditions. And I read that and I thought, yeah, and the aisles where those foods aren't labeled as such. And I think about the stores, the supermarkets in which I've shopped that have these signs over the aisle that say Hispanic foods. Every time I've seen that, I've sent a letter to the store manager. And in the letter asked, what is a Hispanic food? Why is there a separate aisle? But it's because of this assumption that white people know they can find what is consistent with their food traditions, but it's not especially labeled. Why? Because it's perceived as what is normal and natural and expected.
Also, you think about the history that, you know, our kids are taught in school. Generally, it does not or reflect the contributions of African Americans. So white kids, I guess, have the privilege of having a history that talks about white people. But Black kids, in schools are not, don't necessarily have the privilege of, as history or social studies taught, seeing the contributions of Black people as part of the history that's taught. Now,
until, of course, there is a discussion of slavery.
Well, okay, right. And also I was going to say, we also have now Black History Month, which is good, but talking about the contributions of Black people should not just be confined to one particular month. And a lot of times my experience has shown that the conversation is very limited. Teachers tend to talk about Martin Luther King, they talk about Rosa Parks. There's probably a few other people that occasionally come up, but it's not very complete. Focuses on a few people, leaves out a whole lot of other people, and tends to be focused in one particular month. It should be an integral part of the history of America, of the United States, the contributions not only of Black people, but all the people of color.
Absolutely.
Yes.
There's a movie that came out recently or last few years, called Hidden Figures, and it's based on a book, Hidden Figures. And so, one, I would encourage viewers to check out that movie and book. But it's interesting because I don't know how many people knew about the significant contribution of Black women to the space program. I mean, they were an integral part of that program. And until that movie and book came out, who knew it? So that's just an example of people and experiences and events that should be part of the everyday conversation about what happened in our history, particularly related to the space program.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that history that includes other people as a part of the fabric of the country is just left out altogether. When Blacks and other people of color are brought to the curriculum, it is as an add-on, an appendage to the normal, regular flow of things, of history of the fabric of the country. I recall vividly the controversy that ensued over the history standards when they were brought to Congress in 1994. Parents, kids who go to school today probably perceive that the standards documents in the various subject matter areas are common. They probably perceive that they have always been. Well, that is not the case. Before the early 90s, 1990, there were not these national standards. We first got standards for subject matter areas with mathematics. History standards were proposed to Congress in 1994, and that is after 2 years of historians, college, university professors, public school teachers, parents around the country created what they said were appropriate standards for all children to learn. Again, these people were from various racial and ethnic groups. They were from around the country. They were university professors, public school teachers, parents, the public. They all contributed to what became the history standards. And at that time, you may recall, Congress was voting on these standards. We were at the beginning of this emphasis on accountability in education. And Congress voted down the standards. They said, no, go back and do them again. This happened for no other subject matter. And why did they vote them down? Bill Bennett, who was the Secretary of Education at the time, what is that woman's name? The vice president's wife at the time, Lynn Cheney. Bill Bennett, Lynn Cheney, the wife of the head of the Senate.
Elaine Cho?
No. This was in 1994.
Oh, okay.
Sure.
What's that woman's name? Her husband subsequently ran for president.
Go ahead.
Well, anyway, these people and a university professor from New York, they all pressured Congress to vote down these standards, all white folks. And they said the standards have too much of a focus on minorities. There is not enough of a focus on white people and the Europeans who made this country what it is. It is shocking to hear and to read. I mean, the people listening here can go back and look at the newspapers, go on the almighty internet and see that these people actually said there's too much of a focus on minorities. There is not enough of a focus on the white people who built this country. And the reality is this country was built on the backs of primarily people of color. But that is shocking. It was normal and natural for there to be a focus on whiteness and contributions of white people. These folks who created the standards made them reflect the multicultural humanity and contributions, and Congress said, no, you go back and fix that. Make it white like it ought to be, like is normal and natural.
Yeah. And unbelievable. So we are coming to the end of our time, we promised 30 minutes. And I want to give an example, and then I want to ask one question, and sort of end our time with feedback about that. But just to give our viewers an example of what we're talking about. So you were talking about the things that you need to tell your children of color in order to keep them alive, right? When they leave, and one of those items was about if an officer stops you, right? If you're stopped by, then put your hands on the dashboard, don't reach. So my son is, he has his learner's permit. We're out driving around and I'm teaching him how to drive. The one conversation, my son's white, the one conversation I had with him about if a cop pulled him over, the only conversation I had to have with him was to say, pull over as soon as you can in a safe place. Period. Right? I haven't been pulled over often in my life, but I know when I have, my first response is always reach in the glove box, because that is where insurance paperwork and that sort of thing would be, and reach down into my pocket, because that's where my wallet would be that would have my license in it. As a white person, that's not a life or death situation, right? But a person of color, the last thing you would want to teach them would be to be reaching in places around your car before the officer ever came up to you, because that is a life and death situation. And I just hope that our viewers see that. I read an article this week, I think it was in the New York Times, that was making a critique on the idea of white people teaching our children to be quote unquote colorblind. And which to be colorblind means, on one hand, that we're not valuing the diversity around us, that we devalue other people's experiences, and that if we're teaching our children to be colorblind, so to speak, then we're not able to critique this idea of white privilege and what we have either. And I wonder, as we close here, if you might just say something about that. This other phrase that we hear, this idea that we want to teach our children to be colorblind, which I think what people are saying is we want to teach them not to be racist, not to judge people based on the color of their skin, but being blind to that difference of the color of our skin is not helpful either.
No, actually, colorblindness is racism. Because what we are teaching and saying when we opt for colorblindness is that we have to not see a person's color in order to value them, in order to appreciate them, in order to embrace them. They have to be colorless. And actually, when in the final analysis, not only do they have to be colorless, but what we're saying is that we have to perceive them as white. We have this love-hate relationship with color and people's color. We want the culture that people of different colors bring, but we really don't want them to be different. We don't want to see that they are racially different. And that is racism at its core. It means that I can't see you and value you, including your color, all of you. I have to erase that color in order to embrace you. Well, for many people, Blacks and other people of color, who they are racially is rather important. And so when people say that they have to be colorblind, they're saying that what is important to you is not important to me. I have to get rid of that in order to embrace you. This business of colorblindness is another topic that in my view deserves quite a bit of attention, because I think, as you do, people perceive it to be something very, very positive, and it is not. When you say you have to erase, get rid of a significant aspect of who a person is in order to value them, appreciate them, to not treat them badly, you are saying something very negative about who you are, what your values are, how you operate. Yeah. Consider, Pastor, that people have all different types of cars, colors of cars, colors of their homes, colors of their clothes. It's only when we come to people and color that we begin to feel uncomfortable. And that, well, I think that has its genesis very early in our lives, when parents tell people not to see color. Even when children point out a person who might be racially different, parents will slap a child's hand or cover a child's eyes and say, don't point, don't look at that, don't say that. They don't tell them why, they just tell them they shouldn't. They tell them, don't. And the child internalizes, there is something wrong with me seeing that color. Mm. There's something wrong with me pointing out this difference in color when it applies to people.
People, yeah.
Children internalize that, they grow up with that, and then even as adults, when people make reference to color as applied to a person, we get the eggshells, walking on eggshells, that idea, or we get this discomfort in our stomach. We just begin to shake when people draw attention to color as applied to people.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
We start this ugliness with our children very early, and it is racist to its core.
Mm.
I don't want to go back to this conversation and stay there, because I know you say we're going to be out of time, but I want to tell you, when you were talking about what you tell your child as regards a cop stopping him, and what you do when you are about to be stopped by a car, I want to tell you, my entire body was responding to that and shaking inside just at the thought of a policeman stopping me. Mm-hmm. When I see those lights in the back of, in the rearview mirror, I begin to shake all over. And even as you were talking about it, I was shaking, because that experience is not an experience that Black people look forward to. That experience is not one of a friend approaching our cars, but is an experience, an event that we anticipate with fear and trepidation.
Yes, yeah. Very different experiences, which is what one of the reasons why we're doing these videos and trying to help all of us understand these different experiences, and to see them, and in particular in this conversation, to understand the privilege that people like I have, that these are not, that's not a life or death experience for me, being stopped by an officer. So we are at the end of our time. Petrina, I want to give you a final word here. Final word.
The last thing I was thinking about as I was reading some about what other people were saying about white privilege, one person that I read talked about white privilege is also the power to remain silent in the face of racial inequity. It's the power to weigh the need for protest or confrontation against the discomfort or inconvenience of speaking up. Essentially, white people theoretically don't have to say anything, but I'm so glad that at least at this time with George Floyd, a lot of white people have decided that they do really need to speak up, they really need to protest, they really need to have their voices heard. That's not always been the case.
That's right.
Black people, have been fighting this fight, speaking up, pushing for equity for 400 years. I was thinking, and I'll make this short, when you asked us about having these conversations, my immediate response was yes, not because I'm not nervous about doing it, but because I am nervous about doing it, but I felt like I had to, because I really do not have the privilege of not speaking. I really do not have the privilege of taking any opportunity I have to talk about the injustice of this society, talk about the need for change, to talk about the brutality that people of color have experienced over the years. When I've watched the protests on the street, some of the reporters have asked people of color about essentially why are they out there while COVID is still rampant. And basically they say, we don't have a choice. I mean, we're either going to be killed by the virus or are killed by the system. The systematic racism has been killing
Yes.
us for 400 years. So, you know, we don't really have a choice to stay in our house and not say anything. So I just wanted to just add that to the conversation about privilege. You know, who has a privilege to stay in their house and not say anything, and who has a privilege of, or who has a responsibility and almost requirement of speaking out. And, you know, Black people really don't have the privilege of not speaking up against, you know, the systematic racism that's been occurring in this country.
Sure.
And I also just wanted to put one more resource out there. I like TED Talks, and so if people go to TED.com, they have grouped together a number of their talks that speak on racism, going back for a few years. And I thought that they're a very good resource. I'll just mention two of them quickly. One of them is called The Urgency of Intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw. And another one is called Racism Has a Cost for Everyone by Heather McGhee. But there's so many good talks in there. And once you go into that section, you'll see those as well as a whole group of them that I encourage people to watch.
Yeah, very good. And as we did last week, and we will continue growing this list of resources. So if you're watching this and you didn't quite get those TED Talks or the name of the movie, you can look in the description box underneath this video, and the resources that the branches have encouraged us to take a look at and have mentioned in today's talk are there. Also, all the resources that we listed from last week will be there as well, and we'll make those available to folks. And we're going to sign off here, but I hope that people who are listening, you know, some important words there at the end from Petrina, the difference between a necessity to go out and to speak up and to speak against injustice, the difference between a necessity and a responsibility. And I hope as people of faith in our faith community watching this, that we understand that no matter what the color of our skin is, that the content of our faith would call us to a responsibility of speaking against injustice anywhere that we see it, and especially in the racial injustice that we see in our nation, have seen and continue to see. And so that's why we're doing this, that for us as people of faith, this is not just a responsibility, it is a core belief for each and every one of us. And so that's why we're doing this. We encourage you to be people of faith in that way. So branches, thank you again for this conversation. So thankful for this time together. And we're going to sign off. I'm going to stop the recording here. God bless you all. Have a good day.
All right, thank you.